Until the 1970s, women, even those with college degrees and high-paying jobs, couldn't get their own credit cards in their own names if they were married. So Mrs. So-and-so would be on the credit card. And what that meant was that the credit history accrued only to him. Single women face their own set of challenges. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act was a really important first step. It made it illegal for banks to discriminate in lending based on sex or marital status. And we really have Emily Card to thank. She played a pivotal role in making that legislation happen. Emily Card was a young political scientist who applied to be a legislative fellow and ended up in the office of Senator William Brock, a Republican from Tennessee. Emily had had her own problems with discrimination at banks. She'd had trouble getting loans and getting credit cards, and she knew what that was like.
The thing that stood out the first day was there was a press release in my mailbox. It was about the National Commission on Consumer Finance. It said, women are having trouble getting access to credit according to our witnesses. Somebody came up to me and said, Emily, don't plan to do that. You don't need to be involved in that issue. And I said, why not? But he didn't have any idea of what I'd already experienced. So I asked the senator, I said, could I work on this?
So Emily took it upon herself to convince Senator William Brock that he needed to lead the charge on getting women access to credit. He was resistant, he didn't think there was such a problem, and she set out to prove to him that in fact this was a major problem across the United States. As soon as feminist organizations opened their doors in the late 1960s and early 70s, they started getting letters from women all around the country complaining about the treatment that they were getting at banks. Years before Emily Card started working on this, some people had started trying to get it into the law, particularly Bella Abzug, who was a Democratic representative from New York City. Bella Abzug wasn't on the banking committee, so Emily actually coordinated with groups like NOW, the National Organization for Women, and the Women's Legal Defense Fund, and others, to get that evidence in front of Senator Brock. She made sure that he received thousands of letters from women explaining why this was a problem.
He said, well, he was sure there was a problem, but he didn't know if a federal law was needed. He thought it could be a states' right issue. I said, no, it won't work that way because the banks are controlled nationally. We have to have a national law. And he said, well, how can we do that?
She used all of her research skills, she used all of her politicking skills. They wrote the legislation. Emily Card called every woman she knew who worked in Congress to get them to get their congressperson to support this. And Emily Card got to be on the floor of the Senate on the day that it passed.
I felt incredible, and I was really amazed that I was actually there. I came with all kinds of arguments in case anybody brought up opposition, and no opposition really came up. I guess no one really wanted to be against women getting credit.
The 1974 Equal Credit Opportunity Act was a big step in the right direction, but it could not fix everything overnight. And that was partly because when the regulations got written, they didn't have particularly strong teeth. It's also really difficult to root out bias overnight. In 1976, after further pressure from advocates, President Ford signed an amendment to the legislation, expanding its protections to include race, color, religion, national origin, age, and the receipt of public assistance. That was critically important. But even still, change takes time and legislation can only go so far. One way that women set out to deal with the fact that the ECOA didn't change everything overnight was to open up women's banks. These were banks that were mostly run by women, and they wanted to make sure that there was a place women could go where the For instance, loan officers would not discriminate against them. They also set out to do financial literacy classes for women to make sure that women knew how to manage their money and how to talk to bankers. The history of women's financial independence is not just about banks and credit cards. It's part of a much bigger story. That story includes women's unequal access to high-paying jobs, to the problems of unequal pay for when men and women do the same jobs. They need to be able to get food on their table and to make sure, for instance, that their children have what they need to flourish as they go out into the world. These are problems that affect white women and women of color differently. Women with disabilities face their own sets of economic challenges as well. While the Equal Credit Opportunity Act didn't take care of all of that, we do need to understand that it was a major step in the right direction, and that making sure that women had equal access to credit is an important turning point in American history.